What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are going to be dangerous. We're going to be dangerous, Rob Court. We're going to talk about, we're really going to run over X-Men Gold. Now, the reason why I say this is dangerous is because there's really no beating around this. There was a bit of controversy with regards to some art that was basically thrown into this story. It was really more of symbolism, and it was only really understood by people who were familiar and educated about different conflicts going on in other parts of the world. I'm not educated about that. I'm not familiar with that. I really haven't done much reading into it. I know enough to say it was a big to-do, but that part of the world isn't really part of my daily information digest, so I really can't speak too much on that, but it did offend some people, and the result was that it actually ended up, kind of questioning whether or not the person drawing the story was, adequate for the job, which of course we know he's been removed from that position. But the idea is that with Marvel Comics, if you guys kind of indulge me for a second, Marvel Comics has been in a bit of a slump recently. And the reason why is because a lot of people read comic books for the purpose of just getting a break away from the world, and it really happens in a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons. For some people, it's the stress of everyday life, right? I mean, you've got like a father in like his 30s, and he's got kids, and he's got a wife, and he's got a job, and for him, comic books is the equivalent of like going into the garage and messing with a car engine or something like that. Just a way for him to break away from his life, to kind of just, shut his mind off for an hour and a half, read some books, call it a day, and then go back to the grind again. For other people, it's the adoration, of superheroes. It's the idea of, oh, I could be Spider-Man, I could be Captain America, whatever the case may be. And that explains why a lot of people are so upset about like a Hydra cap. For others, it's just the fact that they've been reading it for so long, they've latched on to different characters, and they don't really want to see what they love go away. And that's really the big concern here. But the funny thing about this is that with X-Men Gold, in a lot of ways, it's the return to familiarity that really got me into X-Men, because X-Men was my first introduction into comic books. After that, it started getting into, most of the other publications that were available from Marvel. But X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue, this is not an accident. And the reason why I say that is to go into a little bit of history here. Back in the 1960s, when Marvel first launched the X-Men by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it was just X-Men. That's all it was. When Chris Claremont took over as writer with Giant Size, or I guess following Giant Size X-Men #1, instead of it being called X-Men, it was just called Uncanny X-Men. And so the idea was that it was a wholly separate publication from the original X-Men line of stories that were launched by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Now, at the time when it was launched, it looked like it was just renaming the X-Men comic, which nobody really minded too much because the stories were so good. But when the 1990s, really the early 1990s came around, and Marvel basically relaunched X-Men, what they did is they said, this is like volume 2 of the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby line of stories. And so what they ended up giving us was X-Men Volume 2 alongside the current run of Uncanny X-Men Volume 1. That's why right now, if you were to go and look up the total number of publications for Uncanny X-Men, it's in the hundreds, because the Uncanny X-Men line of stories has been running consistently really since Chris Claremont took over writing back in the 1970s. Now, in terms of X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue, the way this originally worked out is that when Uncanny X-Men was originally launched by Chris Claremont, a new group of X-Men was introduced, and the idea was that the original X-Men team of Cyclops and Jean Grey and Iceman and Angel and Beast, they'd basically been kidnapped by a literal living island. It was a sentient island called Krakoa, and the idea was that Charles Xavier wanted to introduce a new team of superheroes to grab a new group of X-Men that would rescue the original X-Men. So he went around and he got Colossus, and he got Wolverine, he got Nightcrawler, and a lot of these different superheroes. And then when the original X-Men team was launched, or I guess when they were saved, the original X-Men team and the new X-Men team were just rolled over into one line of publications, which took the form of Uncanny X-Men. Now, this ran until some years later. I mean, it wasn't really that long. It was a couple of years or so. And then eventually the original X-Men team left Uncanny X-Men and became X-Factor. And so you had the original X-Men team in the form of X-Factor running alongside Uncanny X-Men. And all this continued until 1991, when Marvel said, okay, let's take the X-Factor team, let's roll them back into Uncanny X-Men again, and then create a new X-Factor team. But anyway, it was a new government-sanctioned superhero team. The original X-Factor team of Cyclops and Jean Grey and Angel and Beast and Iceman, they were rolled back over into Uncanny X-Men, and then it took two forms. So that's when they came in with the launch of X-Men Volume 2. One team was the blue team. The other comic was the gold team. And I want to say that Uncanny X-Men was the blue team and X-Men was the gold team. I might have that reversed, but it was basically giving readers two different, X-Men stories to read. And that set in motion notion, the future of the X-Men comics going into the 1990s, into the 2000s, where you just had like a ton of X-Men publications all going on. X-Men Deluxe, Extreme X-Men, Excalibur, X-Force. You had all different kinds of publications going, but that's the root behind all this, is that when the story is essentially called Back to Basics, again, it's very much a return to the basics. Now, one of the big issues, kind of jumping out of that bit of history for a second and getting back into the main story itself, one of the big issues that a lot of people have had with Marvel Comics recently is the idea of so many comics having a political message. And again, that really feeds into the idea that not a lot of people read comic books for the political messages. Some do, and some comics cater themselves to a political message. Other comic books, the political messages are kind of forced in there. For example, with Thor, as much as I love Jane Foster and as much as I think she's a great character, the Thor line of stories do not lend themselves to political messages. The Thor line of stories is about Thor smashing stuff with his hammer. That's why we read it, because we just want to see Thor just Valhalla and like smash stuff with his hammer. We want to see that. That's the whole thing that we want to get into. And that's reasonable. It makes perfect sense. But the X-Men as a whole always dealt with political imagery. They always dealt with the idea of representing oppression in Marvel Comics, because the X-Men were always like this cast out group in the realm of the Marvel universe. They were the group that like the Avengers would never really come to their aid. They were the group where the Fantastic Four would never really come to their aid. They would cross over if there was some great big huge grandiose event like the Onslaught Saga, fighting Apocalypse maybe, or something like that. But for the most part, the X-Men were always self-contained. And even within the world of Marvel Comics, the X-Men themselves wanted it to be that way. They were like, look, this is all family business. Anything that deals with mutants, that's our territory. All right, Avengers, stay away. Fantastic Four, stay away. All right, we deal with our stuff in-house. We keep it clean. We don't air our dirty laundry. It was always done that way. And it was a way for Marvel to keep things pretty close, play it pretty close to the vest with regards to the X-Men universe, but also expand the ranks of mutants and so on and so forth. And so this takes much the same way. And the reason why is because, well, the X-Men basically kind of face off against Terrax. Not really an important villain here, just, we talked about him in our Thanos videos, which you'll find down in the description. He was a Herald of Galactus at one point, and then basically rebelled and just kind of became this guy that just attacks around and destroys stuff. Once the X-Men basically defeat Terrax, despite the fact that they effectively saved this part of the city, people still don't really trust them. They still kind of look at them with a slanted eye. Now again, this has always been the case. And so those of you guys who are new to the X-Men, who are new to Marvel Comics, your initial inclination might be to jump to the idea of, oh my God, here we go, social justice warrior stuff. No. The X-Men, that's their claim to fame. That's the basis behind their stories. For example, what we actually end up doing here is we pick up with a woman by the name of Lydia. And this particular person, or this particular, woman is just kind of going on and talking about the danger of mutants, about how mutants are inherently bad. Mutants are a threat to virtually everybody. This woman, Lydia Nance, is basically saying mutants are effectively waging like a race war, that kind of a thing. That's not the first time we've seen that. It's always been that way. For example, in Uncanny X-Men number 299 in 1993, writer Scott Lobdell introduced a character named Graydon Creed. And Graydon Creed, one of his big claims to fame is that he led an organization called the FOH, or the Friends of Humanity. And the Friends of Humanity were basically the KKK that hated mutants. They would literally launch these terrorist attacks to basically, frame mutants, say, oh, mutants are the cause, mutants are the reason behind this, we need to do away with mutants. And it was one of the hallmarks, because the mutant population, the X-Men, were fighting battles on two fronts. They were fighting against, the belief that humanity, thought that mutants couldn't be trusted, and they were fighting villains like Magneto, who were giving mutants a bad name. Another really good example is a guy named William Stryker. Contrary to what you've seen in the Fox cinematic universe, William Stryker was never a military guy. The reason why they made it that way was because of the fact that in the comics, William Stryker was a religious fundamentalist. He was this, insane Christian fundamentalist who believed that it was his mission from God to kill mutants. Now, had Fox thrown that into the movie and said, yeah, here's this guy, William Stryker, that wants to kill mutants because God told him to, well then, the Christian population in the US would be up in arms. They would lose their minds because, Fox is basically making them look bad. So again, Fox basically took the safe route and made him a military guy. But in the comics, he leads a group called the Purifiers, and the Purifiers kill mutants wherever they find them. That's one of the reasons why the story, God Loves, Man Kills, is so well received, but also so controversial, because it's so dark. I mean, it's literally the idea of William Stryker going around and saying, these mutants are abominations. God didn't make them. They're evolutionary abominations. God believes they're impure. We need to eliminate them. That's how deep down all that stuff goes. So this method of storytelling has been applied for years. One of the big reasons why Marvel's gotten so much flack recently is because they've basically taken the nature of the X-Men comics, that nature of storytelling, and applied it to everything, whether it needs to be told that way or not. And so again, because of the fact that Lydia Nance is kind of this return to familiarity, this fact that she's going around and espousing all this hatred towards the mutant population, it again basically goes back to the very roots of the fact that the mutants aren't fighting against like Magneto or someone like that. They're dealing with humanity's perception of the mutant population. Now, one thing to also keep in mind here is, remember, following the events of Avengers versus X-Men, Charles Xavier's dead. He's nowhere to be found. And so right now, the current leader of the X-Men team is Kitty Pryde. Now, of course, we saw that in X-Men Prime, I think it was, and it basically saw Kitty Pryde return from her time as part of the Guardians of the Galaxy and take over leadership of the X-Men following the events of Inhumans versus X-Men and that somewhat lackluster story. But the idea here is that we're also reintroduced to Rachel Summers. Now, Rachel Summers has been around, but she's a character that we've never really talked about too much, and she's someone that I actually want to bring up here. So a lot of you guys are familiar with like Hope Summers. A lot of you guys who have been reading comics for a while are familiar with the Hope Summers character. Hope Summers is not biologically related to Jean Grey and Scott Summers. It's just a name she was given. Remember, after the events of House of M, when the Scarlet Witch had warped reality and stripped 98% of the mutant population of their powers, Hope Summers was the first mutant born after the events of House of M. The problem with this is that her birth created this mad dash by a lot of different groups. The returned Purifiers of William Stryker, the Marauders led by Mr. Sinister, the X-Men themselves. It led to a whole bunch of people trying to capture Hope Summers. And so the fact that her family was killed in this massive onslaught meant that Hope, she actually didn't have a name. Nobody knew who she was, but she was eventually discovered and rescued by Cable. And because Cable is the child of Jean Grey and Scott Summers, essentially Cable just gave her the last name Summers and then in turn called her Hope because she represented hope for the mutant population, the hope that there was a future and that mutants were going to return again. And so that's where she got her name from. Rachel Summers is a lot more literal in terms of her relation to Jean Grey and Scott. Most all of you guys are familiar with the Days of Future Past story right now, and so we don't really need to get too deep into that, but it was basically a story where Moira McTaggart and Charles Xavier and Senator Robert Kelly were assassinated by the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and it ultimately resulted in humanity jump-starting the Sentinel program, the Sentinels becoming self-aware, and then enslaving everybody in the United States, humans and mutants alike. And so in that dystopian future, Rachel Summers was the child of Jean Grey and Scott Summers. She sent the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past. Kitty Pryde prevented the Days of Future Past from happening. The result is that that future became an alternate reality instead of the guaranteed future of the Marvel Universe. The issue with this is that because it was an alternate reality, Rachel Summers didn't understand why things hadn't changed. And so what she did is she basically traveled into the past before the events of Days of Future Past were supposed to happen, which resulted in her entering the main Marvel timeline and then encountering the X-Men. The issue is that this took place during a story called The Days of Future Present, and following her introduction into the main Marvel Universe, she just never left. She just never really went back to the Days of Future Past. She just stayed a part of the main Marvel Universe and really was just kind of a free-floating character around the X-Men universe, and that was about it. And so that's really the basis behind her, but she has been a host for the Phoenix Force. She's one of the most powerful telepaths in the Marvel Universe. She's an Omega-level mutant. She's extremely capable in what it is that she can and can't do. The problem with this is that in the midst of the X-Men basically trying to clear their name, or at the very least trying to demonstrate that they are a force for good on the planet Earth, they're drawn to the United Nations headquarters, which has been attacked recently by the newly reformed Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Now, this is not the Brotherhood as it's led by Mystique, and it's not really meant to be. Instead, it's just basically kind of like a recreated version of this team, but it's actually being led by a guy named Mesmero. Now, for those of you guys who remember watching the old X-Men Evolution cartoon show, you probably know who Mesmero is, or at the very least, the name rings a bell. In the show, he was basically this guy who was the herald for the coming of Apocalypse, Apocalypse's return in the X-Men Evolution show. But in Marvel Comics, he made his debut, God, he's old. He made his debut back in 1968 with X-Men number 49, I think it was. I mean, he's been around for a long, long time. Mesmero is a mutant that has the ability to basically control the minds of others, to kind of dominate the wills of others. Now, one of the things that I also want to point out here is that Mesmero is not to be confused with Mastermind. Mastermind gained his claim to fame, and I believe he's going to be in the X-Men Dark Phoenix movie, but Mastermind was a guy who gained his claim to fame by being able to manipulate the five senses. And so he can basically, make you see, touch, smell, taste, hear, everything that he wants you to. And so that's the reason why he was able to dominate the Dark Phoenix, is because he manipulated her five senses into believing that she was somewhere she actually wasn't. Now, Mastermind is a wildly dangerous villain. With Mesmero, he's still kind of powerful, but for him, it takes time depending on what kind of person we're talking about. If it's someone like a very base level telepath, somebody who can just kind of read the surface thoughts of various villains around them, if it's someone who's like an Omega level telepath like Emma Frost, there's really not a whole lot he can do right off the bat. But given time, I operating from the shadows, kind of sneaking his way into the mind of a telepath, he can have a pretty solid effect. The problem with this is that when it comes to Omega level telepaths, they're so adept at their abilities that they instantly know if somebody's trying to enter their mind or something along those lines. And so it's very difficult for Mesmero to manipulate them. But the idea here is that with Mesmero being present, it makes him a very dangerous situation, because if the X-Men lapse, if they stop paying attention, if they're not focusing on what's going on, it would result in the idea of Mesmero seizing control of all of them and then having them perform his own bidding. So again, it makes a pretty dangerous scenario here. Not only that, in the middle of the conflict, they effectively just teleport away. They simply just vanish. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that following the disappearance of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, S.H.I.E.L.D. respawns as is led by Captain America Steve Rogers. Now remember, this takes place before the events of Secret Empire, so Captain America has not revealed himself to be a Hydra agent yet. Now, of course, we know during the events of Secret Empire, the X-Men basically have their own little treaty with Hydra, in the sense that they're allowed their own little space. They're allowed to remain in isolation without the influence of Hydra. Half of that's because of the fact that Marvel spent so long really kind of bootstrapping the X-Men and screwing them over that fans just hated it. They didn't really care about the Inhumans. The other half of this is because the X-Men are pretty powerful. And if you're Captain America and you're running Hydra, do you really want to piss off somebody who can warp reality on a universal scale? So again, it's really kind of an interesting situation when it comes to the X-Men. But the fact remains here that this highlights the relationship or the view of the X-Men in the eyes of the rest of the world. Because where Captain America shows up and begins asking them what in the world is going on, the response of Kitty Pryde is, look, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants was here. We were fighting against them. It led to this destruction here in the United Nations. But the response of Captain America is, well, we don't have any way to verify that. I mean, I guess we could go back and, do interviews, whatever the case may be. But all we really know is that there is just a massive conflict taking place between you and this Brotherhood that exists out there. But in the eyes of S.H.I.E.L.D., in the eyes of different organizations, mutants are mutants. And again, that's one of the skewed perspectives here, because on one hand, the superhero community will look at the mutant population and say, well, Magneto or Charles Xavier, it doesn't matter. They're all basically the same thing. Now, those individuals who know those guys know they're distinctly different. But for a lot of people, they're all basically the same. Mutants are mutants are mutants, and there's no differentiation between who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. It's just this giant ongoing civil war that's been taking place among the mutant population for years and years and years. The other half of this is that using the intelligence available to S.H.I.E.L.D., we learn a little bit more about some of the different members of the new Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Mask, for example, is a Morlock that everybody thought had been dead for a while. Of course, his physical appearance is the reason why he had undertaken, residence in the sewers of New York prior to basically coming out. And, we also know that the character Magma has returned, that Magma's abilities allow her to basically manipulate the magma of the planet Earth. There's a few new people here that we haven't seen before. But in the midst of all this, Wolverine and a couple others were basically taken. Now, Wolverine being taken by Mesmero is probably one of the most important aspects to this. And the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, Wolverine, Old Man Logan, as he exists here, is still pretty dangerous despite his age. And it's not the first time that Old Man Logan's been taken or Wolverine's been taken by enemy forces and made to do their bidding. For example, there was the story Enemy of the State. And Enemy of the State dealt with the idea that Hydra and the Hand had joined forces and then taken Wolverine and brainwashed him and turned him into a killing machine. And so the result was that he was going through and attacking all these different bases and all these different superheroes. Now, of course, Old Man Logan is still pretty dangerous despite his age. Not only that, one of the funny things about this is that he's also still pretty intelligent and still pretty capable. And so what this is designed to do is show that at the end of the day, despite their schemes and their capabilities, they're not the sharpest tools in the shed. These guys are not the brightest. Mesmero is every bit a B-list villain as he always was before, and this story really kind of elevates it by the fact that where Old Man Logan is chained up using adamantium chains, the chair is wooden. And so he basically just kind of breaks himself to freedom and begins fighting off against, a lot of these different guys, and basically incapacitating Mesmero. Now, because of the telepathic shielding that was put in place by Mesmero, the X-Men weren't really able to find Old Man Logan, but he basically grabs a phone, calls him up, says, hey, here's where I'm at, come here and get me and take these guys out. But there also are still a few familiar faces here when it comes to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. For example, Pyro and Avalanche. Now, Pyro and Avalanche are two characters that go back to X-Men the Animated Series, which is where most people remember them. And I don't recall if they appeared before the series or after. I want to say they were before the series and they were just kind of rolled in and became some pretty popular characters. But Avalanche has the ability to kind of manipulate tectonic plates to a degree. He's not like earth-shatteringly powerful, but he's still pretty cool in terms of the abilities that he has. Pyro, of course, as most people know by now because of X-Men Last Stand, I think it was, has the ability to manipulate fire, but can't actually create it. But again, these guys are still pretty capable, and it's still kind of cool to see some of these conflicts and some of these events taking place. But of course, where the X-Men arrive on the scene alongside, old man Logan, face off against him. And of course, we also end up learning that Magma had basically been, was being controlled by Mesmero the entire time, hence the reason why she had turned against the X-Men, where the entire scenario, results in the X-Men basically winning, everything essentially coming down to an end. They ultimately come to the realization that Mesmero had been paid to basically instigate this entire conflict as part of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And this is when we learn that the person that had paid them was none other than Lydia Nance. She was the one that set the whole thing up because in her mind, she basically believes that mutants are a credible threat, and all it takes is time to basically show that threat. Now, in truth, this plot really seems paper thin. It really seems to be like a really basic plot, a really simple plot, but that was the beauty of the X-Men comics back in the day. It wasn't these super grandiose, complex things. One of the reasons why Chris Claremont's run is so lauded by a lot of people who read the X-Men is because it dealt more with the character interactions than it did with the actual conflicts. The battles during his run were not that complex, they were not that difficult. The idea was focusing on the characters, and so that's what this is for. That's why it's called Back to Basics. It's not about creating this super complex plot. It's not about writing a story that's going to last some 20 issues before we see a resolution. Not at all. It's basically there to say the biggest threat that the X-Men face isn't necessarily Magneto. It's not necessarily Mr. Sinister or Apocalypse. It's not going to result in some great big huge conflict, some massive crossover event. In a lot of ways, one of the biggest issues that the X-Men face are just average people out there who have a lot of authority and a lot of respect and decide to use that authority and respect to discredit the X-Men team. So again, it's just kind of a return to basics, return to the X-Men team as we knew it for so often. Having said that, Bastion will play a role when it comes to X-Men Blue. And of course, Bastion, I believe, if I remember correctly, Bastion is the result of Nimrod, the Perfect Sentinel, merging with the mind of Master Mold, the creator of Sentinels. Again, that's kind of obscure and it's old school stuff. A lot of you guys might just kind of be like, what? But well, if we end up covering X-Men Blue, then we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.
Next.